Hey, whoa! I can't see, man!
Hands up! Right now!
Okay. They're up. It's just me. I don't got nothing.
Keep them high. Fingers interlaced on your head. Do it slow.
All right.
And most importantly, it's about the fundamental question that every citizen should be asking. What happens when the people sworn to protect us become the very threat we need protection from? If you've ever wondered how a police officer can end a teenager's life, cost taxpayers a record-breaking amount of money, and still keep their job, then you need to stay with me until the very end of this story, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just tragic, it's infuriating. And it reveals something deeply broken about the way we handle police accountability in this country. Before we dive into the events of that terrible night, I want you to understand who Malik Richardson was, not just as a victim, not just as a statistic, but as a human being with hopes, fears, dreams, and a life that was just beginning to take shape. Malik had turned 16 just 3 months before his death. He lived with his grandmother in the Eastbrook neighborhood of Mesa Vista, California, a sprawling coastal city about 45 minutes south of Los Angeles. His mother had struggled with addiction for most of his childhood, drifting in and out of his life like a ghost that couldn't quite commit to being present. His father was serving time in a state correctional facility, a consequence of choices made long before Malik was old enough to understand what those choices meant. So it fell to his grandmother, a 63-year-old retired hospital cafeteria worker named Dorothy Richardson, to raise him. Dorothy did the best she could with what she had. She made sure Malik got to school. She made sure he had clean clothes and food in his stomach. She took him to church on Sundays and helped him with his homework on weekday nights, even when the math problems exceeded her own understanding. She tried to keep him away from the streets that had claimed so many young men in their neighborhood. But she was fighting against forces far more powerful than herself. The gangs that operated in Eastbrook had been recruiting aggressively for years, targeting boys just like Malik. Boys without fathers, boys searching for belonging, boys who felt invisible and wanted desperately to matter to someone. Malik had resisted for a long time. He was a quiet kid, more interested in music than in street life. He had taught himself to play keyboard by watching YouTube tutorials, and he dreamed of one day producing beats for famous rappers. He would spend hours in his room with a pair of secondhand headphones clamped over his ears, nodding his head to rhythms only he could hear, imagining a future where his name appeared in album credits and his grandmother never had to worry about money again. But dreams are fragile things, especially in neighborhoods where survival often takes precedence over aspiration. And in the months leading up to his death, Malik's life had taken a darker turn. It started with a disagreement, the kind of petty conflict that seems insignificant to adults, but carries life or death weight in the world of teenage boys competing for respect in dangerous environments. Malik had allegedly disrespected a member of a local crew called the Eastbrook Kings during a pickup basketball game at a community center. Harsh words were exchanged, threats were made, and from that moment on, Malik had a target on his back. The threats escalated quickly. First came the menacing messages on social media, then the confrontations at school, then the incident where someone threw a brick through his grandmother's living room window at 2 a.m, sending shattered glass cascading across the carpet where Malik had been sleeping just hours before. Dorothy begged him to tell the police. Malik refused. In his world, talking to cops wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was potentially fatal. The same people threatening him would kill him twice as fast if they thought he was a snitch. So instead, Malik did what countless young men in his situation have done before him. He got himself a gun. How a 16-year-old obtained a firearm is a question that speaks to broader failures in our society, failures we don't have time to fully explore here. But obtain one he did. A small handgun that he carried in the waistband of his pants whenever he left the house. Not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because he genuinely believed it was the only thing standing between him and a violent death. The cruel irony, of course, is that the gun didn't save him. It didn't even factor into his death. By the time anyone knew he had it, he was already bleeding out on the concrete. The weapon he carried for protection became nothing more than a convenient talking point for authorities trying to justify the unjustifiable. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that February evening, to the chain of events that would transform a teenager running for his life into a cautionary tale about everything wrong with American policing. February 11th of this year began as an ordinary Wednesday in Mesa Vista. The weather was mild for winter, with temperatures hovering around 60 degrees and a light marine layer obscuring the stars. Downtown was bustling with its usual mix of commuters, tourists, and locals going about their evening routines. The Harbor Street Transit Center, a major hub connecting buses, light rail, and regional trains, was particularly busy as people made their way home from work. Malik Richardson had no business being downtown that night. His grandmother would later say that he told her he was going to a friend's house to study for a history test. In reality, he had arranged to meet with a girl he had been talking to online, a 17-year-old from another neighborhood who had caught his attention on Instagram. Young love, or at least the teenage approximation of it, had drawn him out of the relative safety of his grandmother's house and into the heart of the city. The meeting never happened. The girl texted him at the last minute to cancel, something about her parents being suspicious. Malik found himself standing alone at the transit center, scrolling through his phone, trying to decide whether to wait for the next bus home or call his grandmother for a ride. He was annoyed. He was tired. He was already dreading the lecture he would get if Dorothy found out he had lied about where he was going. He never got the chance to worry about that lecture. At approximately 8:47 p.m., Malik was walking through the enclosed corridor that connected the main terminal building to the light rail platform. Security cameras would later capture what happened next in grainy detail. As Malik approached the platform, two figures emerged from behind a support pillar. One of them was a boy he recognized, Deshaun Mitchell, a 17-year-old member of the Eastbrook Kings who had been at the center of the basketball court altercation months earlier. Words were exchanged. The footage has no audio, but body language experts would later testify that the confrontation was hostile from the start. Malik's posture was defensive, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Deshaun's posture was aggressive, his finger jabbing at Malik's chest. The second figure, never identified by authorities, stood slightly behind Deshaun, his role apparently that of a silent enforcer. The entire confrontation lasted less than 30 seconds. Then Deshaun reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Malik ran. He ran with the pure primal desperation of a human being who understands at the deepest possible level that death is inches behind him. He ran without thinking about direction or destination. He ran because every cell in his body was screaming at him to move, to flee, to survive. Behind him, the sound of gunfire exploded through the corridor. Deshaun fired 3 shots. 2 of them struck the concrete walls, leaving spiderweb cracks in the tile. The third missed Malik's shoulder by less than 6 inches. None of this was visible to Officer Ryan Brennan. Brennan was 26 years old and had been with the Mesa Vista Police Department for just over 2 years. He had joined law enforcement after washing out of a criminal justice degree at a local community college, drawn to the profession by a combination of job security and what he described in his application essay as a desire to make a difference in his community. His performance reviews had been mixed. Supervisors praised his enthusiasm but noted concerns about his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. One evaluation from 6 months before the shooting described him as aggressive in circumstances that called for measured responses. On the night of February 11th, Brennan was working a routine patrol shift in the downtown district. He and his partner, a more experienced officer named Teresa Vega, had been responding to a report of a disturbance near the transit center when the sound of gunshots cut through the evening air. Officer Vega immediately grabbed her radio. Her voice was calm but urgent as she broadcast to dispatch. Multiple shots fired. Harbor Street Transit Center requesting backup. All units respond. Brennan's reaction was different. Where his partner reached for communication, he reached for action. He was out of the patrol car before Vega had finished her transmission, his hand already on his service weapon. He didn't wait for her. He didn't coordinate a response. He simply ran toward the sound of the shots, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline that would later be dissected by psychologists, attorneys, and civil rights experts. The distance from the patrol car to the corridor entrance was approximately 150 feet. Brennan covered it in less than 15 seconds. His boots slapping against the pavement, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He was so focused on reaching the source of the gunfire that he never considered what he might find when he got there. He never thought about who might be running away from those shots. He never imagined that the first person he encountered might be a victim rather than a perpetrator, These are the kinds of considerations that training is supposed to instill. These are the mental frameworks that separate professional law enforcement from armed civilians playing vigilante. And these are precisely the considerations that Ryan Brennan failed to apply in the most critical moment of his career. Malik Richardson burst around the corner of the corridor at a full sprint. His eyes were wide with terror. His arms were pumping. His sneakers squeaked against the polished floor as he tried to put as much distance as possible between himself and the teenager who had just tried to kill him. He had no way of knowing that a police officer was approaching from the opposite direction. He had no reason to expect that the corridor he was fleeing through would become a kill zone of a different kind. Ryan Brennan saw a figure coming toward him. That's it. That's all he saw. A dark shape moving fast, emerging from the direction of the gunshots. In the 1 second of visual contact that followed, every assumption Brennan made was wrong. He assumed the running figure was the shooter. He assumed the running figure posed an immediate threat. He assumed that deadly force was the only appropriate response. He was wrong on every count. What happened next would be reconstructed countless times in the months that followed. Attorneys would analyze the body camera footage frame by frame. Expert witnesses would testify about reaction times and threat assessment protocols. Community members would march in the streets demanding answers. But in the moment itself, there was only chaos, adrenaline, and a catastrophic failure of judgment. Brennan raised his weapon. Malik was less than 15 feet away, still running, still facing forward, still completely unaware that he was in anyone's crosshairs. His back was angled toward Brennan as he continued his desperate flight. He wasn't charging the officer. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He wasn't making any threatening gesture whatsoever. He was simply trying to survive. And Ryan Brennan shot him anyway. The bullet entered Malik's lower back, just to the right of his spine. The impact knocked him forward, disrupting his stride, but not immediately stopping his momentum. He stumbled, his arms pinwheeling, a sound escaping his lips that witnesses would later describe as something between a scream and a sob. It was the sound of a child who suddenly understood that he was dying. Malik managed to take 3 more steps before his legs gave out. He collapsed behind a row of parked patrol cars, disappearing from Brennan's line of sight. Only then, only after the bullet had already torn through flesh and organ and bone, did the officer's voice finally break the silence. Mesa Vista Police Department. Mesa Vista Police. Stop. Mesa Vista Police. The words came too late. They came after the trigger had been pulled. They came after a 16-year-old boy had been mortally wounded. They were the words that should have preceded any use of force, the announcement that every officer is trained to make before engaging a potential threat. But Ryan Brennan had skipped that step. He had seen a running figure and made a lethal decision without ever identifying himself, without ever giving Malik the chance to stop, to surrender, to explain that he wasn't the shooter, but the person being shot at. This is the moment I want you to sit with. This is the decision that would ultimately cost Mesa Vista taxpayers more than any police action in American history. A teenager running away, clearly in flight from danger, shot in the back by an officer who hadn't even bothered to announce his presence. And if you're watching this right now, if you're already feeling that mixture of anger and disbelief building in your chest, I want you to know that it only gets worse from here. Because what happened after the shooting reveals a system that is fundamentally broken, a system that protects its own at the expense of the citizens it's supposed to serve. Stay with me, because you need to understand just how bad this gets. The moments immediately following the shooting were captured in their entirety by Ryan Brennan's body camera. The footage, which would eventually be released to the public after weeks of legal battles, tells a story that no amount of official spin could adequately obscure. Brennan stood frozen for approximately 4 seconds after firing, his weapon still raised, his body rigid with what appeared to be shock. He didn't immediately pursue Malik. He didn't call for medical assistance. He simply stood there, processing what he had just done, perhaps beginning to understand on some level that he had made a terrible mistake. Then training kicked in, or at least a version of it. Brennan moved forward cautiously, his gun still drawn, approaching the area where Malik had fallen. Behind him, other officers were beginning to arrive, drawn by the gunshots and the chaos of overlapping radio transmissions. The corridor that had been nearly empty moments before was suddenly filling with uniforms, weapons, shouting voices. They found Malik on the ground behind the patrol cars, face down, a spreading pool of blood beneath his midsection. He was conscious but barely responsive, his breathing shallow and labored. His hands were empty. They had been empty the entire time. The gun he carried was still tucked into his waistband, completely concealed beneath his jacket, invisible to anyone who might have looked at him during his desperate flight. It was only after officers rolled him onto his side to begin medical assessment that the weapon was discovered. And in the narrative that authorities would later construct, that discovery would take on outsized importance. A gun. He had a gun. The implication was clear. The shooting was justified because the victim was armed. But this framing ignored a fundamental truth. No officer saw that gun before Brennan pulled the trigger. No officer could have known it existed. The presence of a concealed weapon that played no role in the encounter whatsoever was being used retroactively to justify an action that couldn't be justified prospectively. This is a pattern we see again and again in police shooting cases. The discovery of evidence after the fact is used to rationalize decisions made without any knowledge of that evidence. It's circular logic dressed up as justification. We were right to shoot him because look what we found after we shot him. But the law doesn't work that way. The Constitution doesn't work that way. The question isn't what was discovered after the shooting. The question is what the officer knew or reasonably believed at the moment he decided to use deadly force. And at that moment, Ryan Brennan knew nothing. He saw a teenager running. That's all. A teenager running away from gunshots. A teenager who could just as easily have been an innocent bystander, a frightened commuter, a victim fleeing for his life. Which, of course, is exactly what Malik was. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes of the shooting. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Malik, establishing IV lines, applying pressure to the wound, preparing him for emergency transport to Mesa Vista General Hospital, but the damage was too severe. The bullet had struck his kidney and nicked his abdominal aorta, causing massive internal bleeding that no amount of medical intervention could adequately address. Malik Richardson was pronounced dead at 9:34 p.m., less than an hour after Deshaun Mitchell fired the shots that started this entire chain of events. He was 16 years old. He had never been arrested. He had never been convicted of any crime. He was a kid who liked music, who loved his grandmother, who made the mistake of being in the wrong place at the wrong time and encountering an officer who made all the wrong decisions. Dorothy Richardson received the news at approximately 10:15 p.m. 2 officers came to her door, their faces somber, their words carefully chosen. "There's been an incident. Your grandson has been injured. You need to come with us." They didn't tell her he was dead. Not at first. Protocol dictated that such news be delivered in person, in a controlled environment, with support services available. So Dorothy rode in the back of a patrol car to the hospital, her heart filled with desperate hope, praying that injured meant something survivable, something fixable. It wasn't until she arrived at the emergency room, until she saw the faces of the doctors and nurses, until a social worker gently took her hand and led her to a private room, that she understood the full truth. Her grandson, the boy she had raised from infancy, the boy she had tried so hard to protect, was gone. And he had been killed, not by the gang members who threatened him, but by a police officer sworn to serve and protect. The scream that escaped Dorothy Richardson's throat that night was heard throughout the emergency department. It was the sound of a world collapsing, of a future being erased, of a love so deep that its loss could never be adequately processed. Staff members who witnessed it would later say it was one of the most devastating moments of their careers. Not because it was unusual for families to grieve in emergency rooms, but because of what came next. Because eventually Dorothy had to be told the full circumstances of her grandson's death. She had to learn that he wasn't killed by the boys who had been terrorizing him. She had to learn that he was shot in the back while running away. She had to learn that the person who killed him wore a badge and a uniform. And she had to begin processing a grief that was tangled up with outrage, with betrayal, with the sickening realization that the institutions meant to protect people like Malik had instead destroyed him. The investigation that followed was, by official accounts, thorough and comprehensive. The Mesa Vista Police Department assigned its Internal Affairs Division to review the shooting. The County District Attorney's Office opened a parallel inquiry to determine whether criminal charges were warranted. The Regional Police Accountability Board, a civilian oversight body created in the wake of previous controversies, announced its own independent review. To the casual observer, it might have appeared that the system was working exactly as intended. Multiple agencies examining the incident from multiple angles, each bringing its own perspective and priorities to the analysis. Surely, with this much scrutiny, the truth would emerge. Surely, accountability would follow. But those familiar with how police shootings are actually investigated knew better. They knew that internal affairs divisions are staffed by officers whose colleagues they'll have to work with for years to come. They knew that district attorneys depend on police cooperation to prosecute the cases that fill their courtrooms. They knew that oversight boards often lack the authority to compel testimony or impose meaningful consequences. The machinery of accountability was impressive in its appearance, but often hollow in its function. And from the very beginning, there were signs that this case would follow the familiar script. The first sign came within 48 hours of the shooting, when the Mesa Vista Police Department released a carefully crafted public statement. The statement described the incident in passive, distancing language. An officer-involved shooting occurred. An individual was fatally wounded. A firearm was recovered from the deceased. Notice what was emphasized and what was omitted. The statement highlighted the fact that Malik had a gun, positioning this information prominently to shape public perception. It failed to mention that no officer saw the gun before the shooting. It failed to mention that Malik was running away. It failed to mention that Officer Brennan never identified himself before firing. It failed to mention that Malik was 16 years old. The second sign came when the department released edited body camera footage to local media outlets. The released clips showed the chaotic aftermath of the shooting, but conveniently began after Brennan had fired his weapon. The crucial seconds preceding the shot, the seconds that would reveal just how quickly and unreasonably the decision was made, were initially withheld for investigative purposes. The third sign came when Officer Brennan was placed on administrative leave with full pay. This is standard procedure following any officer-involved shooting, ostensibly to allow for investigation while protecting the officer from prejudgment. But in practice, it often functions as a paid vacation, a period of rest and recovery, while the machinery of protection assembles around the accused. For Malik Richardson's family and their growing number of supporters, these signs pointed to an all-too-familiar pattern. The system was already working to protect one of its own. The narrative was being shaped before all the facts were known, and the burden of proving wrongdoing, which should have rested on the department that employed the shooter, was being shifted onto the family of the victim. This is the point where I want to pause and talk about something that often gets lost in discussions of police shootings: the legal framework that governs when officers can and cannot use deadly force. Because understanding this framework is essential to understanding why what happened to Malik Richardson was so clearly, so unambiguously wrong. The foundational case is a 1985 Supreme Court decision called Tennessee v. Garner. The facts of that case involved a police officer who shot and killed an unarmed teenage burglary suspect who was fleeing over a fence. The officer knew the suspect was probably unarmed. He shot anyway, believing that state law permitted him to use deadly force against any fleeing felon. The Supreme Court disagreed. In a landmark ruling, the court held that the Fourth Amendment prohibits police from using deadly force to prevent the escape of a suspect, unless the officer has probable cause to believe that the suspect poses a significant threat of death or serious physical injury to the officer or others. This is crucial, so let me break it down further. It's not enough for an officer to be scared. It's not enough for an officer to hear gunshots in the area. It's not enough for an officer to see someone running. Before pulling the trigger, the officer must have a reasonable basis for believing that the specific person they're shooting poses an immediate threat of serious harm. Apply that standard to what happened to Malik Richardson. Officer Brennan heard gunshots. He saw a teenager running away from the direction of those shots. He did not see that teenager fire a weapon. He did not see that teenager holding a weapon. He did not see that teenager make any threatening gesture toward anyone. He did not see that teenager do anything other than run. Where, then, was the immediate threat that justified deadly force? The answer is simple. There wasn't one. Brennan made an assumption. He assumed that the person running must be the shooter. He assumed that the person running must be dangerous. He assumed that shooting first and asking questions later was the appropriate response. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong, and a 16-year-old boy paid for those errors with his life. Federal courts in California and throughout the western states have consistently held that shooting a fleeing person who poses no demonstrable threat violates the Constitution. Case after case, decade after decade, the principle has been reaffirmed. Running away is not a capital offense. Fleeing from gunshots is not probable cause for execution. Officers who shoot people in the back when those people pose no discernible threat are violating the most basic constitutional protections. This isn't some obscure legal technicality. This is fundamental civil rights law. This is stuff that every police officer should learn in their first week at the academy. And yet somehow, Ryan Brennan either didn't learn it, didn't remember it, or didn't care. Let me take a moment here to acknowledge the complexity of what I'm about to say. I know that some of you watching this believe deeply in supporting law enforcement. I know that some of you have family members or friends who wear the badge. I know that policing is a difficult job that puts people in genuinely dangerous situations. All of that is true, and none of it is relevant to this case. This wasn't a situation where an officer faced a genuine threat and had to make an impossible choice. This was a situation where an officer made no effort whatsoever to assess whether a threat existed before deciding to kill someone. The entire encounter lasted approximately 1 second, 1 second from visual contact to trigger pull. That's not enough time to evaluate a threat. That's barely enough time to process that another human being exists. And in that 1 second, Ryan Brennan decided that a running teenager deserved to die. If you're someone who supports law enforcement, you should be outraged by this case. Because officers like Ryan Brennan make the job harder and more dangerous for every other cop on the street. They destroy community trust. They invite federal scrutiny and consent decrees. They cost taxpayers millions of dollars that could otherwise fund better training, better equipment, better community programs. They are not the solution to public safety. They are a significant part of the problem. And I want you to keep that in mind as we discuss what happened next, because the response of the Mesa Vista Police Department and the city government reveals something important about how seriously these institutions actually take police accountability. Spoiler alert, not very seriously at all. The weeks following Malik's death were marked by growing public outrage and deepening official silence. The department refused to release the full body camera footage. The district attorney's office offered only vague assurances that the investigation was proceeding. The Civilian Oversight Board, despite holding public hearings where community members testified to their grief and anger, seemed unable or unwilling to compel any meaningful transparency. Meanwhile, Malik's family retained legal counsel. Attorney Veronica Chen, a civil rights lawyer with nearly 2 decades of experience litigating police misconduct cases, agreed to represent Dorothy Richardson and other family members in potential legal action. Chen had built her career on holding public institutions accountable, and she recognized immediately that the Malik Richardson case was exceptional in its clarity. In most police shooting cases, Chen would later explain to reporters, there's at least some ambiguity. The officer says they saw a gun. The officer says they felt threatened. The officer says the suspect made a sudden movement. Juries can be persuaded to give officers the benefit of the doubt in those circumstances. But this case was different. The body camera captured everything. There was no ambiguity. There was no possible innocent explanation for what Brennan did. He shot a running teenager in the back without warning, without identification, without any observable threat. The footage spoke for itself. Chen filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in early April, naming Officer Ryan Brennan, Police Chief Marcus Webb, and the city of Mesa Vista as defendants. The complaint alleged violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, as well as various state law claims, including wrongful death and negligent training and supervision. The damages sought exceeded $50 million. The filing was explosive. Local and national media picked up the story, broadcasting the body camera footage that Chen had obtained through discovery processes and released to the public. For the first time, Americans across the country could see for themselves what had happened in that transit corridor. They could see Malik running. They could see the 1-second interval between visual contact and gunfire. They could hear the belated, useless identification that came only after the shot had been fired. The reaction was overwhelming. Social media erupted with condemnations of both Officer Brennan and the department that employed him. Protesters gathered outside Mesa Vista City Hall, demanding accountability and systemic reform. Civil rights organizations issued statements calling for criminal prosecution. The case became a national symbol of everything wrong with American policing, a clear-cut example of deadly force used without justification, followed by institutional protection of the officer responsible. For months, the city of Mesa Vista attempted to defend the indefensible. Their attorneys filed motions to dismiss, arguing that Brennan was entitled to qualified immunity because they claimed there was no clearly established law prohibiting his specific conduct. This argument was almost laughably weak given the extensive case law directly on point, but qualified immunity has become such a sweeping shield for officer misconduct that defendants routinely invoke it regardless of the circumstances. The court was not persuaded. In a scathing ruling issued in early September, the presiding judge denied the motion to dismiss, finding that Brennan's conduct clearly violated established constitutional standards. The judge wrote that no reasonable officer could have believed that a person running away from the direction of gunshots, posing no visible threat, displaying no weapon, and receiving no warning whatsoever could be shot in the back consistent with the Fourth Amendment. The ruling was a devastating blow to the city's defense strategy. With qualified immunity off the table, the case was almost certainly heading toward a trial that Mesa Vista could not win. The evidence was too clear. The footage was too damning. The legal precedents were too well established. Every attorney who reviewed the case reached the same conclusion. If this went to a jury, the city would lose, and the damages would be astronomical. This brings us to the settlement, and I need you to understand just how significant this settlement is in the context of American policing history. On December 16th of this year, the Mesa Vista City Council met in a closed session to consider a proposed settlement agreement in the case of Richardson versus City of Mesa Vista. The atmosphere in the council chamber was tense. Outside, supporters of Malik's family had gathered for a candlelight vigil, their voices occasionally audible through the thick stone walls. Inside, council members reviewed a document that would commit their city to paying more money than any municipality had ever paid to resolve a police killing case. The final number was $35 million. Let that sink in for a moment. $35 million. That's more than the roughly $29 million paid to the family of George Floyd in Minneapolis. That's more than the roughly $24 million paid to the family of Breonna Taylor in Louisville. That's more than any police settlement in the recorded history of the United States. According to the agreement, approximately $6 million would come directly from the city's general fund. The remaining $29 million would be drawn from a regional liability pool shared by multiple municipalities in the area. But regardless of the accounting mechanics, the bottom line was clear. Taxpayers would be paying an unprecedented sum because of what Ryan Brennan did that February night. The settlement also included non-monetary terms. The city agreed to implement enhanced training programs focused on de-escalation and threat assessment. They agreed to revise their policies regarding foot pursuits and the use of deadly force against fleeing suspects. They agreed to expand the authority and resources of the Civilian Oversight Board. On paper, these reforms represented meaningful progress toward preventing future tragedies. But buried in the fine print was a clause that exemplifies everything wrong with how we handle police accountability in this country. Despite paying $35 million, the largest police settlement in American history, the city of Mesa Vista explicitly stated that the agreement contained no admission of liability by any party. Think about that for a moment. They're paying $35 million. They're implementing sweeping reforms. They're acknowledging, implicitly if not explicitly, that something went terribly wrong, and yet they refuse to admit that they did anything wrong. The legal fiction being maintained here is so absurd that it would be funny if the underlying reality weren't so tragic. We're paying you an unprecedented sum of money because our officer shot your grandson in the back for no reason, but we're not admitting that we're liable for that. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking. And what about Officer Ryan Brennan? What consequences has he faced for killing a 16-year-old boy and costing his city $35 million? As of this recording, Ryan Brennan remains employed by the Mesa Vista Police Department. He has not been terminated. He has not resigned. He has not been charged with any crime. He has been moved from paid administrative leave to something called administrative assignment, which essentially means he's doing desk work while the department continues to review whether any disciplinary action is warranted. Let me repeat that because I want it to really sink in. The officer who shot Malik Richardson in the back, whose conduct was so clearly unconstitutional that a federal judge rejected qualified immunity, whose actions resulted in the largest police settlement in American history, is still collecting a paycheck from the people of Mesa Vista. He still has his badge. He still has his gun. He could theoretically return to patrol duty if the department's internal review concludes that he did nothing wrong. And the criminal investigation? The one being conducted by the district attorney's office? It's still ongoing. Nearly a year after the shooting, there's been no decision on whether to file charges. The prosecutor's office offers periodic statements about the complexity of the case and the need for thorough review, but experienced observers recognize these as delaying tactics. The longer the investigation drags on, the more public attention fades, the easier it becomes to quietly decline prosecution. This is what accountability looks like in America when police kill citizens. This is the system working exactly as it's designed to work. Millions of dollars flow from public treasuries to victimized families, providing compensation, but not closure. Reforms are promised that may or may not be implemented, and the officers responsible for the deaths walk away, their careers intact, their freedom undiminished, their consciences their own business. I want to return for a moment to Dorothy Richardson because in all the discussion of legal theories and settlement amounts and systemic failures, it's easy to lose sight of the human being at the center of this tragedy. Dorothy is 64 years old now. She lives alone in the same small house in Eastbrook where she raised her grandson. The bedroom where Malik used to practice his keyboard sits empty, his equipment untouched since the night he left for his ill-fated downtown trip. She keeps his photographs on the mantle, talks to him sometimes when the silence becomes too heavy, asks him questions she'll never receive answers to. The settlement money will provide her with financial security she never had before. Her attorney's fees will consume a significant portion, as is customary in contingency cases, but she'll still receive enough to pay off her mortgage, to retire the credit card debt she accumulated during lean years, to perhaps even move to a quieter neighborhood where the sound of gunshots doesn't regularly puncture the night. But no amount of money can bring her grandson back. No settlement, however large, can fill the void left by his absence. Dorothy doesn't sleep well anymore. She startles at loud noises. She flinches when she sees police cars. The institutions that were supposed to protect people like Malik, people like her, have revealed themselves as sources of danger rather than safety. That revelation doesn't disappear when a check clears. In interviews, Dorothy has spoken about what she wants most. It isn't money. It never was. What she wants is accountability. What she wants is for Ryan Brennan to face consequences for what he did. What she wants is assurance that no other grandmother will receive the visit she received that February night, that no other family will experience the devastation she experienced. And so far, the system has denied her that. It has written a check, the largest check of its kind ever written, and it has asked her to accept that as justice. It has refused to fire the man who killed her grandson. It has refused to prosecute him. It has refused to even admit that anyone did anything wrong. And it expects her, and expects all of us, to accept this as an acceptable outcome. I want to end this story by zooming out, by considering what the case of Malik Richardson tells us about American policing more broadly. We have, in this country, a fundamental problem with police accountability. Officers can kill citizens in circumstances that would result in murder charges for any civilian and face no criminal consequences whatsoever. Cities can pay millions, tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in settlements and judgments, and the officers responsible keep their jobs. The system protects its own with a ferocity that it never extends to the communities it supposedly serves. And the tragedy is that this isn't some inevitable feature of law enforcement. Other countries manage to police their populations without killing citizens at anywhere near the rate we do. Other countries manage to hold their officers accountable when misconduct occurs. Other countries manage to build trust between police and communities rather than systematically destroying it. We could do better. We could require officers to carry individual liability insurance so that bad actors become uninsurable and thus unemployable. We could eliminate qualified immunity so that victims of police misconduct have meaningful access to the courts. We could establish truly independent prosecution offices to handle police killings, rather than asking district attorneys to prosecute the officers they work with daily. We could mandate comprehensive de-escalation training and tie officer evaluations to their success in resolving situations peacefully. None of these reforms are impossible. None of them are even particularly radical. They're simple, practical steps that would save lives and save money and restore the relationship between police and public that has been so badly damaged. But implementing them requires political will, and political will requires public pressure, and public pressure requires attention, and attention requires stories like this one. Malik Jerome Richardson was 16 years old when he died. He loved music. He loved his grandmother. He was trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to kill him, first through the gang members who threatened him, then through the police officer who shot him in the back. He deserved better than he got. He deserved to grow up to pursue his dreams, to become whoever he was meant to become. And he deserved an officer who would assess the situation before pulling the trigger, who would identify himself before opening fire, who would recognize a fleeing teenager as a potential victim, rather than assuming he was a threat. Instead, he got Ryan Brennan. And Brennan's single-second decision, his failure to think, his failure to warn, his failure to do anything other than shoot, ended a life that was barely beginning. And now we're all paying for it. Literally in the case of Mesa Vista taxpayers, figuratively in the erosion of trust between citizens and the officers who serve them. The system paid $35 million to acknowledge, without admitting, that it failed Malik Richardson. But the officer who pulled the trigger, he's still employed. He's still free. He's still, as far as the official record reflects, a member in good standing of the Mesa Vista Police Department. And that, more than anything else, tells you everything you need to know about how seriously America takes police accountability. Dorothy Richardson will never get her grandson back. No amount of money can change that. What she can hope for, what all of us can hope for, is that his death wasn't entirely in vain, that the outrage it generated, the attention it attracted, the record-breaking settlement it produced, might somehow contribute to a world where the next Malik Richardson doesn't have to die. But that hope depends on us. It depends on citizens demanding better of their police departments. It depends on voters supporting candidates who prioritize genuine accountability. It depends on communities refusing to accept business as usual when the usual business involves killing teenagers and paying settlements and moving on as though nothing happened. So let me ask you, what kind of system do you want to live under? One where officers can shoot first and face no questions later? One where cities write checks but never fire the check causers? One where your life, your child's life, your grandchild's life can be ended in a single second by someone who never bothered to find out whether you were a threat? Or do you want something better? Something that demands more of those we empower to use force on our behalf? Something that treats accountability not as an inconvenience but as a necessity? The choice is ours. It's always been ours. And stories like Malik Richardson's are what happen when we make the wrong one. If this story moved you, if it angered you, if it made you think about these issues in a new way, I hope you'll share it with others. I hope you'll subscribe to this channel so you can follow along as cases like this develop. And I hope you'll remember that the price of freedom isn't just eternal vigilance against foreign threats. It's also vigilance against the abuse of power by those closest to home. Officer Ryan Brennan shot Malik Richardson in the back. He did it without warning. He did it without justification. He did it without even knowing who Malik was or what he was running from. And nearly a year later, he still has his job. If that doesn't outrage you, I'm not sure what will. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And please, keep demanding better. Our lives depend on it.